Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So we are walking through the life of Jesus chronologically. We started with him at 12, and then last few weeks we've been in the book of John. And John is a little bit different than the other Gospels.
The theological term is whopper-jawed.
Okay.
Just kidding. I don't even know how I would define whopper-jawed. I've just heard it used by old folks, and I love it.
Whopper-jawed. Well, the good news is I'm apparently not an old folk. I don't know what that means. But it is, John follows a different path. It's much more conceptual. But our perception is that first chapter going into the second chapter were early on in Jesus' ministry, and then there seems to be a break when they clear the temple. So we're going to transition now to more of following the Synoptic Gospels, and we're going to pick up in Luke chapter 4, verse 14. Now, setting the stage from Luke's perspective, this follows Jesus being tempted by the devil. And so if this was correct timeline, he was tempted by the devil. Jesus was out just traveling around. John pointed people to him. He made some connection with his disciples. And then at some point also he's just teaching on his own and starting his ministry on his own. And the disciples may or may not be with him because it's just simply not clear from the text. Mm-hmm. And so, Connor, I'm curious of your thoughts. And again, we're trying to give dignity to the stories and to the people in the stories. Think about this conceptually, and what we're trying to do is almost think, what if we did not know what was happening? Sure. We've never read it before. And so what would be the setup to this encounter that Jesus has here in Luke 4?
So, one, I love the thought of thinking of, like, what would you expect? And I love reading fiction. I read probably at least 6 to 7, better said, I listen to 6 to 7, fiction books probably a month or so. And so I'm constantly reading, and you can kind of guess the story beats of a given story. And now you expect, okay, I've got some vague idea of this Jesus guy. He's the protagonist. He's the main character. It seems like not only is he the main character, he's some sort of like he's like a main guy who's going to solve a lot of things. And it seems like the highest power has a lot of favor in him. And so you go, okay, what's going to happen next? And you go, okay, he's going to go back to his hometown. And so that means he's going to that's going to be his base of operation, right? That's going to be he's going to come back and they're going to have seen how special he is. They're going to see how amazing he is. And they're going to go, finally, Jesus is stepping into his calling, if you will. And so that would be my expectation. If the story is going to follow how most stories follow, you go, okay, Nazareth, that's going to be his base of operation. That's where all of his main support is going to swell and grow. And so, yeah, that would be my expectation. Even with some of the conversation we had previously of there seeming to be some very negative perception of Nazarenes, especially in the culture of the day.
I think that is good, and I think the idea of thinking through this, if you're in that spirit of what should we expect from this, if you were to say, okay, what are some ways based on what tempted Jesus? He was tempted by food. So that means, it's part of his humanity. He was tempted by people knowing his identity, and he was tempted by accomplishing his mission, that everybody would bow to him, And so that means that's on his mind, and we have an assumption that the devil, when he tempted Jesus, he went for the throat, especially if you're thinking, one of the Gospels says he tempted him for 40 days. The others, it gives you a sense he's fasting for 40 days, but then gets tempted at the end. But assuming the devil is tempting him for 40 days, working him, looking for his weaknesses, these were the pivotal things. These were the things where he thought he was going to get him. And so when I think about how do you accomplish that? How do you accomplish being known and doing those things? And part of it would be power. I mean, there has to be a temptation because Jesus was I'm not going to say surrounded. I don't know how many religious leaders were actually in his hometown, but certainly he had the awareness that, man, when you were a religious leader, you amassed power. And it's like we think of business today, and sadly maybe religious leaders today, but it is that idea of networking and who do you know and things like this. And so I think it would be on your mind to think. I think the question is, would he court the power? Would he be seeking, laying the groundwork for, here's going to be how I really gain credibility and acceptance and power, simply because he was human, just like we're human.
Yeah, man, that's really interesting. And I would love to come at it for a slightly different angle, thinking about how Jesus would have been feeling about this. And we see later on that there is, he is. We see in the story he is rejected. And I just would love to think about the anxiety or maybe anxiety is the wrong term, but just how Jesus would be thinking about his, homecoming, so to speak. And like Jesus knowing these things about himself, also knowing the people he grew up with, and what it would have been like. One, we can talk about when we get to the main part of the discussion, how the rejection must have felt, but simply the anxiety or the wonder of what it would be like to go home. Does Jesus know that he will be rejected, or does Jesus think, okay, this is good, like these people are going to have my back. These are the people that are going to be my firm foundation to stand on. They're going to be the people that are really there for me. And so, just thinking about, like, we've all had a similar, maybe not all of us, but most of us have had a similar situation where we are going to have a homecoming, right? We're going to have we're coming back from school or coming back to our hometown, or like there's this for a lot of us. And if you don't have it, you can sense the absence very strongly. A lot of us have that deep, a lot of us have that group of people that we can go, okay, I can always fall back on them. I can always go back to them. And so I wonder, did Jesus have that feeling? Did he expect what it was to come, or did he, was he blindsided by it?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's a miscalculation to think that Jesus, number one, knew everything that was coming. There are times he does, and I think it's also a miscalculation to not think he will be somewhat emotional. He has had a huge transition. This is a very different Jesus coming back because now the Spirit of God is with him. Mm-hmm. And so how does he perceive himself differently? I know when college students come back, and that's not a parallel, but they're now, most of them, if they've been away for college, they're coming back with a strong sense of their own independence. And there's a question on the table of, will this be honored? And they don't even know necessarily what questions to ask themselves before they actually experience it.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, I just think it's important to keep the humanity of Jesus front of our minds, because everything he does, he's choosing for a certain reason. And I do wonder, is there something, what's the emotional component? I was going to ask if there's an emotional component. I think that's not the correct question. I think it should be, what is the emotional quotient or aspect that's happening?
Yeah, and I feel this so viscerally. I've had this, this conversation with one of my brothers about, imposter syndrome and this weird phenomenon where you can be a fully grown adult who has a family, has kids, has a career, or whatever it would be, and then you see your siblings for the first time, or you're with your family, and you suddenly feel yourself devolving almost into the person you were when you were 13 or 14 years old. And you do wonder, like, for Jesus, was there that, not maybe temptation to fall back into to what he was before, not that he was a different person, but he just had a different role. And so that's a pretty bold thing, like we see in the story of Joseph, how bold it is to like go to your family and be like, hey, there's a new paradigm for how things are viewing.
Right. I had a few dreams.
Yeah, I had a few dreams. Yeah. Or like, hey, those things maybe you wondered, or possibly like I am the most important, like I am the biggest deal. Like that would have its own fascinating dynamics at play when he thinks about his siblings or his cousins or the people he just grew up with. To suddenly go to them and be like, I'm kind of a big deal, would have its own set of fears. And you wonder if Jesus felt tempted to lessen his message or lessen what he was trying to communicate. And so all these things, I have felt them. Not obviously the calling of Messiah, but I have felt those fears so viscerally. And so, I'm fascinated to track that with Jesus.
Yeah, so we're keeping this in mind. We're going to start with 14, and my sense is we're going to have to handle this as a two-parter, as it were, because I think there's so much good stuff to process. In 14, it says that Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. I'm going to stop there, and we'll get to this other aspect first. What amazes you about this piece? All of that dynamic of his choices that he's making here, where he goes, what he says, all of that.
Yeah, I find myself very mostly perplexed by this passage. Most of the things that are jumping to my mind are perplexing. But one of the things that is amazing to me, and I think it's just really important, like the wide ranging things that Jesus comes to communicate to us is so. There's so many aspects, and it's like every time I want to be like, well, Jesus is saying this, so this is the main point. I just go, no, okay, that's not the case. But I do think there is something amazing about one of the first things that Jesus wants to communicate. Not only about like his mission, but like something core to his identity of what his mission is about is to proclaim the good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and the recovery of sight of the blind. And he's quoting Isaiah, but there's also a real tangible sense in which he's saying like, listen, this is my mission. I'm coming to do these things. I'm coming for these people. I'm coming for the outcasts. I'm coming for the people on the edges. I'm coming for the people that nobody really has come for before. And for me, it's one of those things I have to stop and remember, because it's such a, like, I've gotten away from the place of maybe of where I used to be, where it's just like thinking that the ministry of Jesus happened in a vacuum that was easy for me to, translate to today. But remembering Jesus was coming, and most of the time he was speaking to people who were outrageously poor, who were outrageously oppressed in a way that I can't fathom today. And so for me, I think it's just important, even though that's like I know this about Jesus, and it's very present on my mind when I read his words and I read his story. I think it's just important to remind myself, no, okay, this is something different, right? This is something unique and special about the ministry of Jesus. He's not just using the poor as a crowd to bludgeon. He's not just trying to get the outcast because they're the easy ones to poach. Like, no, there's something unique that Jesus is doing, that he is specifically coming in a way for these people, to love them in a way that we don't necessarily see in any other movement throughout history.
I agree. I think this is what amazes me. And we kind of assume it if you know him, but if you're like, what is your opening statement going to be? I would think building credibility would have been high, and maybe a part of it, hey, you have a right to be proud of me, like something's different about me, kind of thing. But I think it's really healthy to say, why is it I think you should listen to me, Mm-hmm. And on one hand, he doesn't get the choice of what scroll he receives. I don't know how much of the book of Isaiah he is given on this scroll, but he does choose what he reads. Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting. And it caused me to wonder, how long did it take him to find this? Was this a long pause where everybody's waiting? His reputation is out there. People are interested because he's been teaching in the area, but not to the fullness. And so these words are really going to matter. And I think it is super fascinating. And I'm also amazed by there's that boldness. He could have said, everybody's watching him, and he says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled. This scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." He could have easily not said that. He could have easily said, "Let's talk about how we're going to do this." Yeah. How are we going to accomplish this? Do you feel this way? Are you the poor in this story? Are you the people that feel oppressed? And obviously, most would be like, yes, as you're observing. And I think it's interesting. He does make it about him. Mm-hmm. This is fulfilled. I'm here to do these things, and I think it's appropriate. This is not like I think he's taken a misstep.
Yeah,
but I do think it's interesting that on one hand, so I guess it's a little bit different point than you're amazed by. I think it is amazing he chooses this passage. Then I think it's also amazing that he makes it very much about him. He's already establishing this is not just general truth I want you to be thinking of. When I preach, and clearly I'm not the Messiah, and I just want to remind everybody I know. But But when I preach, I'm saying, hey, here's this concept, here's this truth. How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to process that? And he could have easily done that. What do we mean by oppressed? What do we mean by prisoner? What does this mean in our situation right now, where we're obviously dealing in this Roman oppression? And I'm not suggesting he's not talking about that, but also the statement, his part, what do they call in preacher word, the homiletics, the presentation he chooses is, number one sentence, and number two, he's like, this is done today. I need you to watch it. Well, what's the X factor? Jesus is the X factor. They've all been gathering, all the time they're gathering here. Jesus is the X factor, and he said, now something is different.
Yeah. So when you said that, something sparked in my mind. I think about they had to always be thinking about, how do we get Rome off our backs? How do we, because and that went into not just like them being, oppressed and being mistreated and a lot of injustice. It also meant like unfair taxes, which meant that they couldn't provide, they couldn't feed their families as well as they probably should, or not even at all. And I think about, for them, when they thought about how do we as a community, as Nazareth, how do we become unchained? How do we throw the oppressors off? How do we get out of the muck and mire of this deep, deep poverty? The common answers, from my understanding, in a city in like Jerusalem, the religious leaders would have been like, well, it's all the people in the outside of here who aren't doing it. Once they start following the Torah, once they start following the law of God, then things will be fixed and then things will be better. So that's my understanding of what the religious leaders would have thought. But you begin to think about like what would have these people in, what's the opposite of urban?
Rural.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to make myself sound a lot better by editing that part out.
Very good. Well, and to say the word rural is always
it's a bet. But then I wonder for these people who are living in a much more rural context, what would their thought have been like? Why did they think that God's favor had left them? Why did they think they were being oppressed? Why did they think the poverty? And you have to imagine, just from the things that we know at the time, a lot of their talk is centered around other, right? It's why the Romans suck. The Romans are terrible. Even, the Pharisees and the Sadducees who are colluding, with the Romans, the religious leaders that are colluding with the Romans, they're also part of the problem, which is a big thing that happens. A lot of the messiahs, or a lot of the prophets who rise up in that time are being like, it's the religious leaders' fault. They're colluding with Rome. If we could get rid of them, then God's favor would rain down upon us. And what I love here is Jesus centering and saying, hey, listen, the problem, the Romans are a problem, right? The oppression is a problem. But the way this gets solved, the way I want to frame this is not about what other people do. It's about what I'm doing. And I think that for me is a fundamental shift, right? And we can see this today in churches and outside. So much of the time when we talk about how do things get solved, how are the captives set free, how are the chains of bondage, how are those unshackled? So much of, well, if they would do this, if they would do that. And I think one of the messages that Jesus wants to start off his ministry is saying how all this gets done. It's not an outward thing, it's a me thing. And that is a paradigm for how he wants to, I think, shift these people he's talking to, how they think about it, but also how I need to shift things in my own heart. Because I'm constantly thinking, how can they fix it? How can they be better? How can they do this? When I think the reality is, if I'm truly trying to be like Jesus and die to myself, the answer is Jesus is going to fix this somehow. How is he going to do it? And how can I be like Jesus to be a part of that fixing solution, or just his work on earth?
That fascinates me, and it kind of shifts my perception, on one hand, and I think there's legitimacy to think it's interesting that he starts with himself instead of building a bridge. And honestly, how little he says. Mm-hmm. What self-respecting preacher is going to give you a sentence when everybody's hanging on your every word, And it's enough. He says that one sentence, and there's a contingency. They're speaking well of him. They're amazed at the gracious words that come from his lips. That's enough. But on the other hand, I'm like, what else can he say? Mm-hmm. This is the difference between Jesus and every other teacher ever. It's completely based on a person. Mm-hmm. This is not primarily, Christianity is not primarily a principle-based religion. It's a relationship-based religion. It's your connection with Jesus Christ. So what that means is, and of course, we understand, well, this is step whatever, but it's going to lead to this, But if you're sitting there, you don't know that, And to some degree, Jesus doesn't know it. He can be confident of God, but he doesn't know it like he knows things that have happened in his past. And so this is a declaration of his own faith to say, I'm not going to hedge bets. I'm going to come out and I'm going to assert this is the truth of God, and this is what's really, really important. And you need to understand that there weren't, I don't even think in this setting, no, there aren't any blind people that are healed in this setting. Mm-hmm. There aren't any prisoners, at least physically imprisoned people that are locked down that are healed or rather freed today. And so it's what he's basing this totally is on his identity. He's really saying this comes down to this truth. I am the Messiah. And I think we're going to get into, it'll become more clear. People caught that when we go and read the next section. But I think even just with what he said, it's to me, it's a very intentional and it's a very powerful statement he makes. Mm-hmm. So you had said earlier that how much of things perplexed you. Is there any one or two things that stand out to you that are perplexing?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that perplexes me about this is simply, you said something along the lines of how what else could Jesus say? But then I think that's true in one sense. But then I also go, man, are you going to have a harder audience than you're going to have now? And the fact that there isn't blind healed, right? There aren't prisoners freed. There isn't literal. There isn't literal evidence per se happening right now. I just think, man, that's a big thing to say, right? That's a lot to ask of any crowd, right? And we'll see people who see literal miracles of Jesus, ultimately reject him and ultimately reject what he says about himself. And so I think about this is a yeah, you would think you're gonna be hey, you know me, it's your guy Jesus. I was gone. You guys like my tan. I've been traveling a lot recently. Well, okay, so you remember back when I was 14 years old and I did this, or okay, so all those things. You remember now? It makes a little bit more sense. I'm telling you, I'm here. It's X, Y, and Z. I just think the ask is so extra hard than I would have previously thought when I had thought about what would it be like. For somebody who grew up with Jesus in his hometown to accept Jesus in this moment. I think the ask is a lot more difficult than I would have thought previously. And again, maybe there's some things where the entirety of Jesus' upbringing is no, you couldn't miss it. They were all wool-headed idiots who just didn't pay attention at all and purposely ignored signs. I don't think that's the case. But yeah, I think just to give dignity, I think, man, this is a massive ask. And I'm not saying that in a pejorative way to Jesus, but simply in a this is a lot harder than I would have originally thought.
I may regret bringing this up, but I had this picture in my head if Superman, if Clark Kent were going to go back to Smallville in his hometown and break it to them first, that he is Superman. It just hit me. It's I would say, hey, you guys remember back in, 94 when, something happened and all of a sudden that was made right? Mm-hmm. That was me, and what? And he's because I'm Superman. And, and so many differences in this situation. But what's interesting and perplexing may not be the right word. It's intriguing to me, maybe a little bit confusing, but at 16, it says he went to Nazareth where he'd been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went to the synagogue as was his custom. So what's he doing between that? And he could have got there Friday night, of course, but what is he doing just casually? And this is always interesting to me. John will write at the end of his book that Jesus did so many other things, And clearly, there's a lot of time. I don't know if you're listening to this, I hope you recognize there's a lot of time that's not recorded. If you take every story, even if you were to say, yes, this happened 3 times instead of once, recorded from different, vantage points.
Sure.
You're not filling up 3 years,
No.
And so it's relatively small amount of time that's being documented here. And I just think that's fascinating. What's his small talk? Is he interacting with his siblings? Because it's interesting, and especially when we get to the next episode and we talk about the tension that erupts. Where's his family? You know what I mean? Are they like, are they caught off guard by this? Are they? I mean, you just got to imagine, having had the experience of going to my dad's hometown or my dad's town, and I've had this ministry experience. Often they'll be like, "Hey, would you want to preach on Sunday?" And I can't imagine telling a story about me preaching at my dad's church and not including my dad.
Yeah.
So he comes back to this, to this synagogue that I assume he'd been to many, many times. Because keep in mind, it wasn't like he was 12 here and then now he's 33. The assumption is he was there a few weeks ago. You know what I mean? As a 30-year-old man or a 29-year-old man or whatever, he had been there and he had relationships. So not just his family, but the guy he worked with, where did he buy his wood? I mean, all these kind of things, So it's just this fascinating whole universe that exists there that I've not really noticed before, because I'm thinking of as Jesus as the preacher, and that's accurate. That's a role he has. But he also has these coexisting roles of son and friend and maybe employer. Who's sitting in the audience that worked for Jesus? Did that happen? Did he have a subcontractor that was mad at him because, even though Jesus didn't sin, maybe there's something that happened that ticked him off. I don't know,
Yeah.
And the point is, the Bible doesn't include it, but I do think it's important to recognize, and that's kind of the point of why we're approaching it this way, how much is happening around him. Because it's often in the perplexing pieces that I'm asking, it generates questions about myself. Yeah. I'm like, how does this show up for me? How much do I let the surroundings affect me and maybe not listen to God on things, not go maybe where God wants me to go? How much am I in a room? And I'm often in a room with people and I'm sharing truth, and some of it's hard truth. And we've tried to cultivate a space where we can be honest and everybody's safe, but still, there's a little bit of a threat, and sometimes I might pull a punch. And then sadly, and I hate to admit this, and I hope it happens very rarely, but sometimes I punch a little harder, and I wonder how much does that come up, to this point. If he could have said any number of things from the book of Isaiah, you have to acknowledge this was a choice he made, what he read. And then second, he could have followed it up with any number of things that would have been much easier, much more incremental. But he says it, and they catch it, because of the tension that ensues. They catch it that he's saying, hey, there's something really much more special about me than you could imagine. So much so, this thing that Isaiah, one of our great prophets, and there's no sense among them. I can't even imagine they're thinking, well, yeah, of course, there's Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then Jesus. Now, this is the guy that's the carpenter, you know? And so that part, all of that just happening at the same time, it's not as surprising to me how volatile this gets quickly.
I think that's a perfect way of summing it up, because you assume just because it happened this way that this is how it was always going to happen, that Jesus, when he was walking his life, had a very easy like his path was just a straight line right here, that Jesus was just a tank who he had Jerusalem, he had the cross in sight, and it was just a tank roll straight to the cross, and Jesus is constantly moving towards the cross. But the reality is, like we talked about last week, in terms of people changing and shifting Jesus, not even people attempting to change Jesus' mind or move Jesus in a particular way, but just by Jesus existing in the medium of being a human being, there are all these other people, all these constant emotions, all these different factors that are forcing him to react to them, forcing Jesus to shift and change how Jesus would have gone about life if they were static, boring, fill-in characters that sometimes we make them out to be. And so, yeah, I think the way you sum that up is just so helpful for me to be like, of course it gets chaotic. And you get to even just expounding to the further story of Jesus, like, of course it got messy. Of course it ended up the way it ended up. And then I begin to think, even as I maybe previously think about the stories of Jesus, oh yeah, he's just on a steamrolling path towards the cross and can't be deviated at all, and it's a straight line. You go, man, could the cross have happened if how I have perceived that Jesus operated was he was just, he had his straight path that he was sticking to, and
like his marching orders.
Yeah, his marching
he knew
orders.
in advance. Here's
marching orders. Here's here's step A, B, and C, and D down the line towards the cross, and you go, oh, I don't think the cross couldn't happen if that's how Jesus was going to live. So much of what the cross is wrapped up into is rejecting that principle, that Jesus could not be moved by other people. That, like, if Jesus was who so often in time I give Jesus, I take dignity away from the story of Jesus and the people around Jesus by being like, well, it had to happen exactly this way, and it had to happen, and so many of the people just become placeholders in the story of Jesus. But then I go, no, so much of what the cross is Jesus recognizing, Jesus loving us and loving the disciples around them. And to love somebody, you have to recognize them as unique individuals who have a unique voice and unique power. And so when Jesus dies on the cross, when Jesus goes to the cross, part of that is acknowledging that everybody encountered and everybody that's ever lived is not a placeholder, but a unique image bearer that has a unique saying on how the world goes. And so for me, I love the way you put that.
Yeah, and I would just add in that, and this is it's what you're saying, but just to kind of even magnify this piece. One of the big things is God created you in His image, and He gave you free will. And that is not a safe bet. That is a recipe for disaster. If I'm an author, if I'm a creator, I maintain control. Mm-hmm. My creation does not have free will because it's going to go away. I don't expect it to, or I don't want it to go. And Jesus did too. So you have this huge, this is such a, cosmic was the word that came to my mind. It's just huge what's happening here on this stage. And I think you're exactly right. When he says it's being fulfilled today, he's saying, I am he, and they caught it. Well, that's exactly why he was crucified. He said he was he. He's the King of the Jews. He's the one that they were talking about. And so it's fascinating. On one hand, he's throwing down a gauntlet, and he's saying, look, this is the part I can't hedge on. This, no matter what you thought of me, no matter how well you think you know me, this is the part. And honestly, when I look out at Christianity, Christendom, I'll work on that.
You got it. Perfect.
Next week. But when I look out, I think he's still saying the same thing. He's like, look, I'm not hedging on this. And sometimes I am. Sometimes Jason is, where either I'm overemphasizing something that he did not hardly talk about, or I'm underemphasizing something that he's like, this is the essential part.
That's so good. Yeah, I love that so much. And yeah, I loved this discussion so much. And we've been doing really good about time, not going crazy long. So I'm gonna cut us there. There's so many different things we could talk about with this story. But yeah, I loved where we left that. Thank you for listening. Grace, peace, and love.